10:30 and go ahead and begin. It occurred to me this morning that whoever put the program together in just this way, having my lecture follow Bruce, was a little mischievous, okay, because you got a very broad view of Hayek, the spontaneous order, undesigned order, and all that. And in this presentation, you're going to get the tinker toy aspect of Hayek, and all I can say in defense at this point is it's the pre-1937 Hayek. It's the Hayek that could draw the structure of production and represent the whole thing as a triangle, okay, and do battle with Keynes with that little piece of graphic. But that's the relevant part of Hayek we want to look at when we're considering putting Hayek and Keynes head-to-head. So we want to look at what Hayek was doing while he was at LSE and while he was doing battle with Keynes. I'll show you how the spontaneous order fits in. It's certainly not contradictory with what I'm doing today. It's supplemental to it. So this is Keynes and Hayek head-to-head. And just to get our characters straight, there they are. And one thing you can observe is that Hayek was quite a little bit younger than Keynes by 16 years, which didn't slow him down much. He sort of stood head-to-head with Keynes in any case. I'd argue that if you look at the literature of the period, Hayek and Keynes, to a large extent, simply talked past one another, and the debate, so-called, you put it in quotation marks, wasn't exactly a debate format. It was more in terms of reviewing one another's books. So Hayek reviewed Keynes' book, not the general theory, but the earlier book, Treatise on Money, and Hayek responded with an attack on prices and production. Keynes didn't write the review. He had Piero Srava write it, so there was some indirectness in the way that they debated back and forth. Never came quite head-to-head, and my objective is to put them head-to-head. It's really not as difficult as it might seem. There they are, okay? Little known photo from the archives. But it turns out Hayek lost, okay? He lost by lots of criteria, but mainly political criteria, I would argue. Keynes had a theory that was ripe politically for exploitation. You could employ Keynesian policies and then harvest the votes, all right? And there were the same policies that were sort of in the air anyhow before Keynes wrote, a point that Israel Kirzner made. Hayek's idea of the economy didn't afford politicians that same kind of option. They didn't have any policy that they could advocate and collect votes. Okay, so that's why I think it lost out. Okay. Now, I'm going to start out with just a little bit of text here because I want to get it straight about the Keynesian vision and the corresponding framework, and the Hayekian vision and corresponding framework. And it goes like this. Kirzner mentioned this. The Keynesian vision is something of a circular flow. It's not a process that has a beginning and an end, but continues indefinitely as a circular flow. Spending and income are linked in that way. People earn an income and spend it. If they themselves don't spend it, investors spend what they borrowed from the saving of individuals who have earned it. And you need a match between spending on the one hand and earning on the other. That's what gives rise to the circle. If circular flow describes Keynes, then means and ends describes the Hayekian vision. So you have production is transformed over time. Time is integral to the production structure into consumable output. Okay, so those are the two visions. Graphically, the circular flow appears as a cross. How do you get from a circle to a cross? Well, fine. it's pretty easy. You divide the circle into half. One half is income earning and the other one is spending the income. Divide it into half and put one half on each axis. So you get expenditures on one axis and income on the other. And then show that it's income itself, rather than prices, wages, and interest rate, that adjust to bring those two magnitudes into balance. Graphically, of course, the means-ends framework appears as the Hayekian triangle, where goods in process move through time from early stages to late stages, eventually having an output of consumption goods. Now, you don't see anything here about the spontaneous order, but it's implicit in the constructions. And that is that in Hayek's view, there is a spontaneous order, there is a market system that actually brings about these results of allocating resources among the stages of production to produce an output that's consistent with people's preferences, particularly their time preferences. In Keynes, you have to flip to chapter 24, that's his last chapter, to see that he summarizes saying that capitalism has some inherent flaws. And the inherent flaws is essentially that there's no market mechanisms to do anything of the sort, that the market system is sort of at sea without rudder, especially in the context of saving and investment, and the interest rate that the classical economists, that meant everybody that went before Keynes, thought existed, but doesn't, according to Keynes. The expression he uses, there's no nexus, there is no nexus that unites people's decision to save with investors' decision to invest. If that were true, the economy would certainly be in trouble. Now, I'm going to do a brief review of the Keynesian circular flow framework, but let me ask here, how many amongst you, I think quite a few, have had at least one college-level course in macroeconomics and seen all about Keynesianism? So it's not something that you're unfamiliar with, but I want to present it in such a way to give myself the advantage in showing you the difference between Keynes and Hayek. So I'll start out with the circular flow framework, in which we have business organizations at the top. That's just a shell. It's an institution that brings together workers and capital and entrepreneurship and all the rest. We have all the people downstairs here, workers, consumers, investors, the owners of resources, and so on. Let's begin our circle. We have the workers, especially the workers, that's Keynes' emphasis, providing labor and other factors. In Keynes, the other factors kind of drop out and it's all labor. That's why I call it labor-based economics. They get paid for it, of course, and that's called income. If you have any sense of symmetry, you know that's just half the story. Goods get produced through the business organizations and supplies goods and other services to those same people, collectively at least, and they have to pay for it. It's called expenditures, okay? This is the simple Keynesian model that doesn't have, the expenditures could be on consumption goods or investment goods, but it doesn't have an interest rate in it. I'm using the simple Keynesian model, not ISLM or aggregate supply, aggregate demand. If I use those things, it wouldn't change our conclusions here, and I want to keep it simple. I will introduce the interest rate as a policy tool, because that's what it was in Keynes, and that's what it has become. There's the policy tool. Federal Reserve policy, they could adjust the interest rate. Let's see if we can get this thing circulating here. Yeah, it circles, okay? The circular flow actually circles. It's not circulating very fast. Well, no wonder. The interest rate is set at 6%. If the Fed sets at 2%, can we do that? Yeah, there it is. It circulates faster. If that gives you inflation, slow it down and go back to 6%, and it slows it down, okay? That's the Keynesian conception of how the interest rate works to affect the economy. It affects investment, not very much, because investment is interest inelastic, but that's the way interest rate mechanism works in Keynes. Let's stop this thing now, okay? That's Keynes. Now, Hayek has a very different view. He has means ends, and of course that's the Hayekian triangle. Time is in the picture explicitly. He even allows for changes in the shape of that Hayekian triangle. We can watch that. Goods and services moving through it. Changes in shape. Okay, that's the dynamics of Hayek. So you can see these two are a long ways apart. They're a long ways apart. They have different visions, different frameworks for the economy. But what I think I can do is start with Keynes and make it morph into Hayek and show what changes are needed to do the trick. Now, we'll start out with a Keynesian economy in equilibrium. That means income equals expenditures. Y equals E, that's what you see it in your textbooks. For a wholly private economy, we can write Y equals C plus I. If it were a mixed economy, it's C plus I plus G, of course. I've learned down at Auburn, especially it's Alabama, to actually spell out wholly private economy. Otherwise, my students think I meant H-O-L-Y. You know, they've been watching too much Sean Hannity or whatever. And here's where we go, kind of jarringly, but we go from the circle to the cross. But just divide that circle into two parts, and one is expenditures on the vertical axis, the other is income on the horizontal. And the 45-degree line, of course, shows where they're equal. In other words, one half of the flow equals the other half of the flow. That's the 45-degree line. There it is, right? Consumption equation, of course, is bedrock to Keynesian theory. And notice that it doesn't depend on the interest rate. You'd think that if the interest rate was high, income earners might not spend so much now, instead put their funds at interest because it'll grow pretty fast at a high interest rate. But no, Keynes denied that interest rate was in the saving equation. So it's simply C equals A plus BY. It's linear. It shows that people consume something, namely A, even when temporarily they earn no income. And as their income goes up, so does their consumption, but not by as much as their income. That's the marginal propensity to consume. That shows the parameters there. Investment is just something you pile on top of consumption, and note here that instead of showing them as alternatives, we show them as additive kinds of expenditure to give you total expenditure. And then we go through the little demonstration of the equilibrium income. In other words, we have a 45-degree triangle there, so that the base being income, that's what we're measuring on that axis, is equal to expenditures, namely consumption expenditures plus investment expenditures. And so the adjustment mechanism to get you to equilibrium is income. Income spirals upward or spirals downward to get you to full employment. The types of spending are distinguished not in terms of means and ends, but just in terms of their stability properties. That C is stable, doesn't shift around. Investment is unstable, it shifts around pretty dramatically and unexpectedly. And G is stabilizing. It's the flywheel. It sort of offsets changes in total income, given that investment income is unstable. Okay? And that's what that says. Okay. Now, I want to represent full employment on this diagram, and I've got this drawn in such a way to my own benefit that the economy just happens to be at full employment. And how can we show that? Well, let's see, according to Keynes, it's only by accident or design that the economy is actually at its full employment level, but fine, let's assume that we're lucky and it is, okay? So we're going to assume full employment here. And what that means is the economy is on its production possibilities frontier. So if I trace across at the current level of income, which we're taking to be full employment, we see that the investment, which is measured horizontally over there and vertically in the left diagram, is just enough to put the economy on its frontier. That's full employment. Now, Keynes represents full employment in a different way. He looks at the income level and sees how the labor market is doing. Yeah, it's operating on its PPF. What Keynes would do is look at the labor market. It looks kind of Marshallian, supply and demand for labor and a market clearing wage rate. He interprets it differently. Keynes would say, well, let's look at the supply of labor. He's got no beef with the neoclassicals on that. And look at the going wage. Never mind how it got going, but look at the going wage. And ask, is the demand for labor strong enough to clear that market? But not too strong, because it'll give you inflation. And the answer, yeah, it is. We're lucky enough that the demand just happens to be strong enough, but not too strong. So that would be full employment for Keynes. Okay? And that's what that tells you. He even represents income as W times N, number of worker hours bought and sold times the wage rate. That's labor income, but he treats that as if it were total income. Again, that's why I call it labor-based economics. Total income is proxied by labor income because other forms of income move in lockstep up and down with labor income. Sometimes he says labor income and the labor equivalent of other forms of income. Okay. So I label that Y sub FE mean full employment. Not that it has to be, but it happens to be right now. And now we're going to have to deal, let's see, we'll bring our circular flow back in there. And Keynes brings in this idea of psychological factors, which is really all that control investment. He uses the term animal spirits 3 times in a page and a half, which means that that's the term he wanted, okay? And so investors are moved by the animal spirits. If the animal spirits are on the wane, you have a fall in investment. We don't have an axis for animal spirits, but oh, there they are right there. Okay. Now that ought to cool any investor's heels. And if it does, guess what? Investment diminishes. And so we'll let it diminish, okay? And now, of course, C doesn't equal, or Y doesn't equal C plus I, but instead you have excess inventories, which is the trigger that sends the economy into a downward spiral, isn't it? Okay? Economy would crash. Now, the outward effect of that is that inventories are piling up over there at the level of the firm. See if we can get them to pile up. There they are. Inventories are piling up with all those excess inventories. Okay. And so the economy crashes, and there it goes. All right? Now if we look at the labor market, well, first I'll show you investment fell by delta I, and that caused income to fall by delta Y. And that's where you get the Keynesian multiplier that you all had to learn to take tests on. But note here that consumption also fell. Not the consumption equation didn't shift downward, but you moved along it. So I fell and C fell. That means you're inside the PPF, doesn't it? Well, yeah, the economy spiraled down into depression. Look at the labor market, and you see the demand is down, but the wage level, because wages are sticky downwards. The way I like to say it, note that the going wage keeps going even after the market conditions that gave rise to it are gone. This is an integral part of the general theory. How general is it? Okay, now we have a further loss of confidence that you're not surprised about, and the economy crashes again, and it's the same playbook, except we're deeper into depression now. Keynes actually argues, well, for one thing, the wage rate he wouldn't say is stuck too high. He'd say it's stuck just right. It's right. That wage rate's right where you want it if only we can get demand back to where it was when we started. That's what we want to do. We don't want the wage rate to adjust to this situation. And he actually argues that eventually the economy would recover on its own, because machines would wear out, and finally there'd have to be some investment undertaken, if only to make good on that, and the economy would go back in the other direction. But why wait? He wants stimulus packages and so on instead. But let's let the economy recover on its own, and it just retraces its steps. We can it's headed back that way. You can see it's just retracing its steps. People are getting optimistic now. We got a waxing of animal spirits. And you'll see I've got ... It's back to its full employment level. But if it's animal spirits that are in play, there's no reason it should stop there. You could get, over-exuberant. And the economy keeps going. There it goes. But now we're beyond full employment. Well, you can't do that. You can't go beyond full employment in the Keynesian system. And so what happens is prices and wages get bid up. So the labor market looks a little different now. Instead of more output, you just get higher wages and higher prices. All right? And that's the basis for the so-called backwards L-shaped aggregate supply curve. Okay? That's the name of it. It's really not L-shaped, it's backwards. And it's not a supply curve, it's a locus of equilibrium curves. And you can see it looks like I'll do it in orange. I do everything in orange and blue because those are Auburn colors. Keep my students interested. That's the L-shaped aggregate supply curve. You could do the same thing with goods, but it would look just like that. It would mirror that. Okay. Now, what we want to do, I'm going to start morphing from circular flow to means and ends. And I'll reset and go back to my fully employed economy. And let's carry along this PPF. Keynes couldn't object because for him, you would be inside the PPF if you're in the depression. But we'll keep track of it explicitly. And I can go through a similar sequence. I'll be much quicker here, just because you know what's going on. There's the waning of the animal spirits. Now watch it on the PPF. See, the economy is coming inside the frontier. And it goes down further. Here it goes. Further waning. Another crash. Look at it in the PPF. It goes down further. And if we trace out a lot of these points, again, watch the PPF, we can trace out points inside, at, and beyond the PPF. And they trace out in a linear pattern. Turns out it's pretty easy to write that linear equation. We can draw a line through it like that. And what I've put on the board here, I don't know if you can see this, it's kind of dark, but all this is a simple consumption spending, C equals A plus BY, combined with the Keynesian equilibrium condition, which is Y equals C plus I. And if you combine those, eliminating the Y, you get the relationship between investment and consumption. And I've written it on the board down here, C equals A over 1 minus B plus B over 1 minus B times I. I'll have it on the screen here in a minute. I can show you that if investment fell to 0, you can see where that would be here. I don't go down that low, but you can see where it would be. That would give you the vertical intercept on that straight line. And if you do the calculations like I've done on the board here, you can see what the parameters are. That you would get an intercept of that straight line as A over 1 minus B with a slope of B over 1 minus B. So I can write the equation of it up there. I call it, and that's significant that I call it. I mean, no one else had to call it anything because no one ever drew it, okay? I call it the Keynesian demand constraint, which means the economy is constrained to move along that line, which implies trivially it cannot move along the PPF, okay? It can only move inside, outside, or at that one point where you are at full employment. I would challenge you, any of you, to find me a principles text or an intermediate text or a graduate level text that includes that equation. They don't exist. It's never drawn. And yet, to me, it's very revealing of just what Keynesian theory is all about. Okay? I thought that I might be the first one to have that equation in print because it was part of my time and money. And when I got my copy, my first copy of Time and Money, I turned to page 136 to make sure. And it turns out Routledge has left a little space there for an equation, but they left out the equation, you know. So, well, I tried, you know. I tried to get it in print. And in the second printing, it showed up. So I think I still won. No one had put it in print until that point, as far as I know. But at least if you find it, email me and tell me about it. Okay. Now, what I want to show you is that Keynes fully understood this. He didn't say so in the general theory, but he said so in the 37 article that followed the general theory. And he gave a very simplistic rendition. Essentially, he let A equal 0. Well, A is not 0. It's some positive amount, but okay, we'll go along with Keynes. And B is 0.9. Well, if you plug into the equation, then you simply get C equal 0.9 times Y. That would be the Keynesian demand constraint. So here's what Keynes says about it. He says, if, for example, the public are in the habit of spending 9/10 of their income on consumption goods, it follows that if entrepreneurs were to produce consumption goods at a cost more than 9 times the cost of investment goods, they are producing some part of their output that could not be sold at a price that covered its cost of production, which means they wouldn't produce it. So they would only produce if I is only produce where C is 9 times I in that case. The formula is not, of course, quite so simple. Well, no, because A is actually positive. But there's always a formula more or less of this kind relating output of consumption goods, which it pays to produce, to the output of investment goods. This conclusion appears to me to be quite beyond dispute. Of course, Hayek would dispute it. Say, no, Keynes, we can move along the PPF. That's the whole point of the Austrian macro. Yet the consequences which follow from it are at the same time unfamiliar and of the greatest possible importance. Yeah, the importance is the market ain't going to get you to the frontier except by accident. And if you actually want to be there, then you need an extra market force, government, to do stimulus packages or monetary policy or whatever it takes to get the economy to go where you want it. Okay, that's the idea. Okay. Now let's keep track of the interest rate. And Keynes actually wouldn't object to this. We've got the loanable funds market. And the interest rate there is clearing, where saving equals investment. In Keynes, saving equals investment when you're in equilibrium. But he doesn't carry the loanable funds market along because he says it's redundant. You don't need it. This, I'll remind you, is the diagram that Keynes put in the general theory and then threw out. And what I'll show you here is that he threw it out because of the very argument that comes out of this particular demonstration. Let me show you. See, here it just says Keynes thought that neither saving nor investment depended to any great extent on the interest rate, but he didn't argue against drawing them that way. He just said the two curves always shift together, so the interest rate doesn't get changed. In which case, he points out, you can't claim interest rates are determined by the supply and demand for loanable funds, because the two curves are locked together at the intersection point. We'll see about that shortly. Okay. Now, with loanable funds in play, we see that decreased investment is accompanied by a leftward shift in the demand for loanable funds. If animal spirits are on the wane, investment shifts down. Well, of course, business aren't borrowing to undertake investments. And that's why investment goes down. So when I pull the trigger this time, I want you to keep your eye on the loanable funds market. The investment curve will shift down. The demand will shift to the left. Okay? There it goes, like so. All right? Now, you know, if Hayek were here, he would say, well, look, Maynard, the interest rate's got to be lower now. The interest rate gets bid down. That would increase the loanable funds more. Prices would adjust to where consumers would spend. But Keynes's reply is that no, Fritz. Keynes hated to be called Fritz. I don't know if Keynes actually, or Hayek hated to be called Fritz. I don't know if Keynes actually called him that or not. No, Fritz. Before that happens, something else happens, and guess what? The economy crashes. Okay, so the spiraling downward is it just dominates the story. So watch it crash. But when it crashes, you'll see up here what you saw before, spiraling downward. That's what's in the text. And what you see in the loanable funds is that savings shifts to the left. Because if people earn less, well, they're saving less. Okay? So watch it crash. There it goes. It shifts to the left, and it shifts to the left by the same amount that investment shifted to the left. And if it does, the interest rate hasn't changed, so why bother with this whole diagram? That's Keynes' attitude. Again, you see we're at, we've got unemployment there. All right? And here I point out again, this is the graph that appeared in the general theory, and I can point out further, it appeared in the general theory for Keynes to make this very point. This was the point he was making. That the interest rate's out of play because both of those curves shift together and the interest rate isn't changed. All right? Now, that appears on page 180. Let's bring it into view. It doesn't look quite the same, but we can show that it is the same. I hope you all see the ultimate sin that Keynes has committed here in drawing a graph. You see what it is? He didn't label this vertical axis, okay? Well, okay, maybe it was the printer that didn't do that. After all, they left out my whole equation. You know? All they did is fail to... but he's got a lot of other shifting there. And the vertical axis, in the prose, he says it measures saving and investment. So he's got the graph sort of cronkwise with saving and investment. We can put it up there for him vertically. And interest rate, he calls it R, means rate of return, horizontally. Okay, so to make this graph look like ours, we have to flip it over and rotate it. All right, okay, we can do that. So flip it over and rotate it, so you got saving and investment horizontal, and you start out at an equilibrium there. But some of the argument is just showing that income is a shift parameter. When income changes, savings change by shifting of the saving curve. Yeah, that's right. And so let's eliminate the savings schedules that are simply to show that it's a shift parameter. So we can eliminate those, and we've got that diagram. And now we'll relabel our R as equilibrium interest, which is really what he had in mind anyhow. Now he's ready to make his point, and his point is precisely that if the demand for investment funds falls, that causes the economy to spiral downwards, incomes are less, and with incomes less, savings is less, and by the same amount, okay? So savings shifts matches the income, or the investment shift, and so you end up with the same old interest rate, but lower level of saving and lower level of investment. This, of course, you can show it over here too, this, of course, is simply Keynes's paradox of thrift, which he acknowledges even in this context. In other words, you try to save more. No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that, because this time it's a shift in investment. Let me bring the paradox in later. If investment shifts, the economy goes in the dumper, and the interest rate doesn't change. That's what we get there. So again, the diagram I've got on the don't worry about it because consumption spending doesn't shift downward. The A and B are parametric, and you should be happy they don't. Because if they did, they would send us into depression. Okay, there you are in depression again. Let's see, I want to get that. Now, to resolve this paradox using the Austrian theory requires only that we replace the Keynesian cross, which reflects the economy's circular flow, with a Hayekian triangle, which depicts means and ends in their temporal sequence. So I want to introduce that production time element. And it's easy to do because you can see, let's see, let me clean this up. Yeah, clean it up. And you can see this is the level of consumption from here to here, isn't it? And that is the consumption goods that's the output of the final stage of the Hayekian triangle. Well, let's just stick that triangle in there. See, there's consumption. So let's just stick the triangle in there. So just as far as the framework is concerned, I've made that adjustment and get rid of the C plus I plus G. And I've got something that looks pretty Hayekian, except it's got that demand constraint over there. Well, let's keep that for a minute. Let's keep that for a while. What I want to do first is keep the Keynesian vision. Okay? Let the economy perform like Keynes thought it performed. And we can do that because Keynes in the general theory is chapter 4, actually. This is called Choice of Units. Sort of a throat-clearing chapter before he got into the good stuff. Okay? But in this throat-clearing chapter, he says, well, we'll assume a fixed structure of industry. Well, I mean, that translates into Austrian theory as a fixed structure of production. It doesn't change in shape. The structure is fixed. All right, well, there he goes again. Now we got wage rates fixed, prices fixed, interest rate doesn't change, and the structure is fixed. That's what gave him a general theory. Okay. How general is it? Well, that's his general theory. But if it doesn't change, then it can only shrink or grow. It can't change in size. And even shrinking, what it does is just that the capital is underutilized. If you have unemployment, well, you have unemployment of labor and unemployment of machines. You have idle machines. They're still there. The structure's still there, but they're idle. Okay. If you look at his labor market, he would associate the same labor market with all the stages. Okay. And so, rather than pulling down this chart or the supply and demand at a particular point along the structure of production, it applies to all the points because labor is labor. It doesn't matter where in the structure it is. The structure is fixed anyhow. Okay, so that's his labor market, right? Now, market mechanisms in play here are still those envisioned by Keynes. Okay, so the paradox is still with us. An increase in saving causes the economy to spiral down to less than full employment. So let's watch that. We'll increase saving, which is loanable funds there over on the southeast diagram. There's an increase in saving. Now that demand constraint shifts down too, because that's still part of Keynes. And what happens to the Hayekian triangle? We get a crash there, and look at the triangle. It's the same shape because the structure didn't change. It's just the capital is underutilized, and so you're getting less of everything, less output, and so on. I could have showed it changing proportionally, but I just did it like that. The point is that Keynes' argument about the spiraling down, which does apply to investment at retail. In other words, people cut back, they're not stocking shelves, transportation services cut back, people aren't bringing goods to the store. That's the only effect that Keynes has into play. And it works on the structure of production all the way down undiminished. And there's no interest rate effect for two reasons. One is the structure is fixed, by assumption, and so the whole question of an interest rate effect is out. Plus, the interest rate didn't change because with the shift in saving back to where it was in the falling into depression, it clears the loanable funds market at the same rate of interest. Okay, so the interest rate hadn't changed and didn't have any effect on capital anyhow. All right, so the economy is again in the dumper as before, with unemployment all along the line. You don't have it sectorial unemployment. It doesn't pick up early stage, late stage stuff. It's just you got unemployment all along the production possibilities frontier. Okay. So I think that's what this says. The effect of the structure of production comes from the initial reduction in consumption. The drive demand effect works undiminished on all the earlier stages. Okay, the interest rate's out of play. That's what that says. Okay. We'll reset again and dress it up like a Keynesian would. But now we're in a position to make some adjustments in the assumptions. And what I want you to see is I can make 3 changes in the assumptions and turn it into the Hayekian model. And my question to you is, are any of these relaxations of assumptions objectionable? And would they be objectionable to economists generally if they focused on this particular presentation? The first one, 3 modifications. The first one, divide the structure into stages of production. Okay? Well, fine, that's easy enough to do. Divide it into stages of production. And the second one, guess what? Allow for stage-specific labor markets in which wage rates adjust to changed market conditions. So, in other words, it won't do to have one labor market depicting each and every stage of production, namely because of that interest rate effect. Okay, so let's get rid of the Keynesian view and bring in the Hayekian view. So now we've got early stage, late stage. Those are just representative. You'd actually have one of these at each and every stage. You don't have room to put them all on there. That's 2. And look, if these things can change differentially, such that labor moves from here to here, then the triangle is no longer fixed in shape. That you can have increases here and decreases there, and a change in the structure of production. So, and if you have that, then you can move along the frontier, which means that that old Keynesian demand constraint is no longer constraining. Doing this and this is what? Remove that constraint. Okay? So that's our third adjustment, is get rid now of the Keynesian demand constraint because it's no longer constraining. Okay? So what's the Keynesian demand constraint? Got rid of it. Gone. Okay. Now, for all, what have you got left? You've got the Hayekian model. Okay, that is the Hayekian model, and you can see that the paradox of thrift becomes, I call it a gateway to growth. A little hyperbole. Sorry about that. You know. So with wage rates and interest rates both adjusting to changes in market conditions, the economy can move along the PPF, and the structure of production can adjust to an increase in saving. Well, thank you. Okay. And so now let's watch again. There's an increase in saving. There's no demand constraint in that crossing the PPF. The labor market has changed just like we want it. You got a decrease in demand for late stage, an increase in demand for early stage. That is what allocates resources towards the early stages and moves the economy along the frontier, and the economy grows. It maintains full employment and grows at a faster rate. Okay? This was Hayek's criticism of Keynes at the time he wrote the treatise on money, which was 5 years before he wrote the general theory, but it applies in spades to the general theory. Mr. Keynes' aggregates conceal the most fundamental mechanisms of change. When we let those mechanisms show through, we get the Hayekian results and not the Keynesian results. We get the means-ends framework and not the Keynesian framework. Not to play favorites or anything. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, we got any questions? Yeah, over here.
You asked what a mainstream economist objective of free assumptions that you want to relax. The one that stood out to me was the second one about wanting to have wages not sticking downward in individual stages of production. How would you motivate allowing for that if they're psychologically impossible downward?
Okay, the question is one thing that mainstream economists, probably mostly the so-called new Keynesians, would object to is the idea that wages aren't sticky downwards, okay? And the way I'd respond is that claim about wage rate stickiness is typically made in the context of an economy in which, for whatever reason, all wages need to shift down by some particular amount, okay? And usually it's in terms of a monetary disequilibrium where there's, say, less money. And with less money, prices have to fall and wages have to fall. And they all have to fall by the same amount. But there's the who goes first problem, because whoever takes a wage cut first ends up, paying higher real prices in terms of his own wage and so on. And that's the sort of wage stickiness that they're concerned about. In the Hayekian view, you've got some wages need to go up and other wages need to go down, and by various extent depending on where they are in the structure of production. And that kind of adjustment is an adjustment that occurs every day, even when there isn't an increase in saving, okay? So all over the economy, suppose no increase in savings, and we're not talking about paradox of thrift. Still, we have a vibrant, dynamic market where different goods are demanded from day to day, or at least from week to week or month to month. And adjustments all over the economy have to be made in terms of input prices, including labor prices, but particular labor prices in different markets. And for the economy to achieve that, all it requires is supplies and demand in those particular markets to move in accordance with what we teach in microeconomics, all right? So I would say if there really is a major problem in that regard to this presentation, that same major problem probably should exist even at the micro level, all right? Typically it doesn't. If it does, it's not because of imperfection in the market, but maybe a union obstacles to keep wages from falling or something like that. So what's needed is all these relative price adjustments and relative wage rates adjustment. That's what the market is good at, okay? But the Austrian economists would agree that if wages in general had to all fall by the same percentage, it would be a piecemeal thing. There would be some relative price changes while it was adjusting. This is Horowitz' lecture, isn't it? And that's why Hayek adopted this productivity norm, so you'd stay away from that situation. But the situation I've shown on the board isn't that. What I showed on the screen was some wages need to rise, some wages need to fall, and the market performs at its best in precisely those circumstances. Yes?
You threw out Keynes' assumption of rigid wage policy.
Right.
But I was curious why you didn't also throw out his assumption of flexible monetary policy.
Flexible
monetary policy.
Oh, well, that's not an assumption of his, that's a conclusion of his. In other words, one of the things he concludes is that we need discretionary monetary policy in order to offset the problems with the market caused by the inflexible wage rate policy. Yeah, so I mean that gets thrown out, but because it's no longer a policy implication once you've allowed wages to adjust. Okay. Yes.
In this array of teachers calling themselves post-Keynesians,
Uh-huh.
while not being that willing to Keynesianism or Hayek or anything like that, so my question is there any merits to post-Keynesianism in your view, and why do you think that many people adhere to that brand without being willing to discuss what it actually means?
Without being, yeah. What's post-Keynesianism, and why do people adhere to that view without actually spelling out what it means? I guess a straightforward answer would come from an article written by Joan Robinson on so-called post-Keynesianism. And she described it as a grab bag of ideas. In other words, the ideas of post-Keynesianism don't mesh into some coherent vision or some coherent view. But what post-Keynesianism is old classical Ricardian cost of production theory that's combined with chronic Keynesian demand failures. All right? And right there, it's rather strange because Ricardian cost of production theory implies that all prices are strictly supply determined. So if that's true, who cares about demand? Demand doesn't change that, okay? So what's so bad about a Keynesian demand failure if everything's determined by production in any case, all right? It has a very strong, post-Keynesian has a very strong, not just cost of production theory, but labor theory. And so there's a Marxist element in it. So it's a left-wing version of Keynesianism, all right? And it's hard to do. I couldn't do a PowerPoint where I compared Austrian or Keynesian with post-Keynesian because I couldn't put together a coherent view of post-Keynesianism. And one thing I'll invite you to look at, if you'd like, there's a book used in England that is aimed at upper-level undergraduate British students, which translates on this side of the axis or Atlantic to second-year graduate, I think. But the book is called Modern Macroeconomics. It's edited by Snowden and Vane, and mostly written by Snowden and Vane. And they're pretty good. They have a broad view. They know different schools of thought. And the book is set out in a school of thought per chapter format, which is kind of neat, kind of nice. And so they knew all of the different schools of thought except two. And one was Austrian and one was post-Keynesian. Okay? And so they farmed those two out. They farmed out the Austrian to me. And they farmed out the post-Keynesian to Paul Davidson, who's a key post-Keynesian. All right? Now, I invite you to read those two chapters. And if you read mine, you'll find a framework. Well, it's this one, okay? You'll find a framework. It's sort of the Reader's Digest version of Time and Money. And you read Davidson's, and you tell me what you find. I'm not sure what it is. Because he talks about approach, but he never says what the approach is, or view, what's the view, don't know, you know, on and on. And never puts together a framework. So to me, that's very symptomatic of what post-Keynesianism is all about. Other questions? Either I've got you fully satisfied or totally bewildered. Oh, another question back there?
I just have a question about the Keynesian
You're talking about the new Keynesians now?
Yes.
Okay. It just, are we on time or out of time or what? Have we got? I got 15 minutes. Okay. Which we may or may not use, but I just want to make sure I'm not running over. New Keynesianism has some good ideas. There's some good ideas in it. There's some good people working in it. So good that most of them will recognize that the name itself doesn't mean anything except for being new. And I would even dispute that. It's not all that new. Greg Mankiw, who is sometimes considered ground zero for New Keynesianism, admits freely that they could have just as easily called it New Monetarism. And none of the New Keynesians actually read the general theory. Okay, almost no macroeconomists. It's kind of sad because the only macroeconomists that are reading the general theory are the Austrians. It might be a little bit of an overstatement, but not much. All right. So they don't read the general theory, but they've heard that Keynes says wage rates sticky downwards, and the newness, and this is quote almost verbatim, or at least it gets the flavor. The newness of New Keynesianism comes from their reasons as opposed to Keynes' reasons for claiming that wage rates are sticky downwards. And he says we have more sophisticated reasons for claiming that wages are slow to adjust. And I'll make 2 points there. Well, the reasons are, this is 1 point, what he calls menu costs. So they focus on the cost of actually changing the menus and taking out, $12.95 and putting in $14.95, and so, or putting in $10.95. And so people might be reluctant to reduce the price of an entree because they'd have to bear the cost of changing the menus. That's the menu cost. That's sort of the general idea of what it means, but essentially it means whatever costs there are to putting out new catalogs, changing prices of what you're selling, and so on. So that's what they're calling more sophisticated. Okay. Now, on my scale of sophistication, when I read Keynes, he was a little more sophisticated than that. But I guess the second point I'll make is that in economics, we have a fairly well-established criteria for testing for statistical significance. Okay. But so far, we don't have a standard way, a generally accepted way of testing for theoretical sophistication. How sophisticated are you, anyhow? But it turns out that just that people seem to win on that front. In other words, whoever claims for themselves sophistication tends not to be challenged. Okay, you people are more sophisticated. I don't believe it, but that's the story. Anybody else? Yeah.
After the general theory, you can see Hayek moving like far away from the business cycle theory and going into other fields. I can't avoid the smack that somehow he stopped to believe maybe in his sound theory.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to expand a little more about this.
Okay.
And the other question related to this is after that period in Hayek, I couldn't quote major advances in the Hayekian tradition of business cycle until you.
Well, thank you.
Besides you, do you think there are other authors who deeply work in these traditions?
Let me answer that second question first. The question is, what advances has there been in Austrian business cycle in the recent period, in modern times? And he refers to my case, in my PowerPoints, I guess, or book as an advancement. But yeah, there are others. In fact, probably the most significant other is Steve Horwitz's book, and Horowitz had a different agenda than I did. Our books came out at virtually the same time, and they were widely viewed as companion volumes, which I think is the correct way to view them. And what Steve did was, see, I was contrasting Hayek with Keynes. Did other things too, but that was a major enterprise in that book. In Horowitz's book, he shows important interconnections between the Austrians and related schools of thought that are associated with the names Bill Hutt, for instance, and Leland Yeager. And those two, in fact, Horowitz said, were two of the most underrated macroeconomists of the century. Some such, I think that would be a good way of saying it. And so he's showing that in a broad sense, the Austrians aren't alone, that they can draw from these other monetary theorists as well. Yeager builds on Clark Warburton, who was a pre-Friedman monetarist, and in my judgment, a better monetarist than Friedman. All right, and Leonhofen, here's another case. Well, I guess Steve mentioned Yeager and Hutt, but a third one, which he also deals with, Axel Leonhofen, who put out a book in '68 that was titled with Keynes' name in it. You know, it wasn't exactly new Keynesianism; it was Keynesian economics and the economics of Keynes. You know, and yet all of his important insights were not Keynesian and were more consistent with the Austrians. And so, you know, there's developments that are sort of thinly disguised in that way that are worth reading. So I say read Leonhofen and read Hutt and read Leland Yeager, and you'll get some ideas that gel and fit in and reinforce and add to the Austrian framework. Okay. Now, the earlier question, which I think is a good question, worth answering for sure, is looks like Hayek sort of abandoned the battle and just got out of what he called technical economics and into political philosophy, road to serfdom. Yeah, road to serfdom and all that. And that's true. And that's true, he did. But I think a big reason why he did is that he lost as far as the profession was concerned. He was just fighting a battle that even though he still thought he was right, he was losing so badly that he went on to other matters. A component of the problem went like this, that when he presented those lectures at LSE, he literally used that Hayekian triangle, and it got a lot of criticism. It was sort of too simplistic. And it is. It's simple anyhow. I think it's the right degree of simplicity if you're going against Keynes. But it's pretty simple. It can't take into account durable capital very well and a number of other things. So he decided to turn to the task of writing 2 volumes. One would be the pure theory of capital, and the second volume would be the effects of capital in a monetary setting. Took him years to write the pure theory, published it in '41. And it was stillborn. I mean, nobody read it. Okay. And by that time, he had tired of it. He saw it wasn't getting anywhere, and so he didn't write the second volume. He actually put in a couple of short chapters at the end of the pure theory that would cover the material that he initially planned would be in the second volume. Okay, so that was his last attempt to try to turn the battle around. All right, and then there was the political aspect of it, that right or wrong, policy was going to be patterned after Keynes because there's where the votes are. All right, and so that inspired him to turn to political economy as opposed to pure economics. But I have one slide, I think it's in my earlier show, that I kind of sloughed over in the name of time, where Hayek reaffirms in 1978 that he still accepts that Austrian theory of the business cycle. He hasn't rejected it. A few years earlier than that, 75, he contributed a paper to a little monograph where he talked about the spiraling inflation that was going on at the time and argued strictly in terms of wages and labor and unions and so on, never mentioning capital. And about that he said, at least in conversation, I don't know if it was in print to this effect, that he was just trying to stay in the game, that he was going up against other people who were talking about the inflation-unemployment trade-off. And so he started talking about that too, but in more Austrian terms, but without bringing in capital. Because he was trying to stay in the game and do what he could to get a handle on the inflation. But then in '78, he sort of reaffirmed that he still believed the old Austrian theory of the business cycle. Okay? Let me take it. If this is a quick question, I'll take it.
It's not a quick question.
Oh.
But I wanted to ask how Lockman would view things differently that requires no Keynesian conclusions.
Oh, Lockman? Okay. Well, I got a quick answer, and that's C. Peter Lewin. He's the Lockmanian. Don't tell him I said that. Pardon? Oh, okay. Well, let me take one back here. Yeah.
Sorry. You said that you lost the value of Hayek. I'm wondering, was it because of too simplistic theories? Do you think it was because the politicians adopted Keynes? Because when the recession came, you can't have politicians that will just take their hands off and say, hey,
Yeah.
we're not going to do anything. We'll correct
Right. Right.
Do you think that they needed Keynes to say, hey, look, we're doing something.
Yeah. 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 So did the onset of depression and the perceived need to do something about that contribute to abandoning Hayek and going to Keynes? And the answer is yes, but the way you put it is in terms of the politicians. Okay, the politicians, certainly that applies to them, but the academics abandoned Hayek too, like Lionel Robbins and John Hicks and others in England. They abandoned him on theoretical grounds. Hobbler. And here there was something else in play. Let me explain it real briefly. It involved a misinterpretation of Hayek, and I'll leave it as an open question whether it was a willful misinterpretation or not. And that is that when the Depression came, the economy not only spiraled downwards, it spiraled downwards for 3 years and into deep, deep depression. Okay? And they made two arguments. One is that Hayek's idea of a maladjustment in the structure of production couldn't possibly account for that huge fall. It took something equally huge to account for that huge fall. Okay? And I think that was a misinterpretation of Hayek. I mean, Hayek was accounting for the downturn. Why does the economy have to downturn? He didn't say how far it was going to fall, and how far it fell depended on the perversity of policies pursued after. Okay, so that's one point. The other point is that if the economy is in depression, even this is said by even the academics like Hobbler or like Robbins. I'll pick on Robbins particularly. So if it's in depression, you don't worry about what got it into depression. You try to see what you can do to get it out of depression. Okay? And the example he used, he says, if a drunkard falls into an icy pond, you don't give him lectures on why he shouldn't have drunk so much. You see what you can do to get him out of the pond. Okay, so I wanted to separate the issues and how we got in and how we got out. There, let me break, and we could pick it up in the evening discussions. Thank you.